Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by my colleague Dylan Pahman, Research Fellow and Executive Editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality here at the Acton Institute. He's also founder and president of the St. Nicholas Cabasilas Institute for Orthodoxy and Liberty. Today, we'll be discussing his new book, The Kingdom of God and the Common Good, Orthodox Christian Social Thought. This is from Ancient Faith, is just out earlier this week. And Dylan, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Good to be here, Dan. Good to be back.
We have discussed a chapter of this book previously, talking about Christians in the ancient Near East. We will link to that in the show notes. But I want this to be like a very much broader conversation because your book is very broad and it presents a sort of extended discussion of Orthodox social thought. And the first question to tee it off is, why do we need that extended discussion?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the book opens actually with a survey of other Christian traditions' social thought. And that is to partly show that like other Christians, whether they be, Catholic or Lutheran or Calvinist, they have their own ways, their own tools to authentically approach the problems of our modern era, and especially our modern economies, from within their traditions. And the Orthodox Church, it's not that we don't have the resources for that, but it's just under-theorized. We don't have very much. I do at the very end of the book talk about some recent statements from a few different church bodies, but even those are pretty vague, pretty shallow when it comes to economics. And part of that's just because nobody's really done the work to put it all together. So this is the book that I kind of wish existed 14 years ago when I first started working here at Acton and started doing this research and getting curious about my own tradition while editing such great work from other traditions for the Journal of Markets and Morality. And I started writing papers, and one by one, I kind of got a better, bigger picture of this sort of thing. And this book is very much a culmination of that.
So when you're doing this sort of academic research, like you've done these papers, these are very defined questions, limited in scope. What was the biggest sort of difference between your previous academic work and doing this sort of, it's not that it's less academic, but its scope is so much broader. How did you go about that writing process? How is that different for you as an author? And what is the experience going to be like for a reader? Because there's a difference between, this book is very much not a collection of academic articles. It is the product of academic research, but it's not a collection of previously published monographs. It's an original work crafted for a new audience.
Right. So it actually began as a series of essays written for Father Daniel Greason's blog, Every Thought Captive, which now is a podcast. Maybe I'll be on that. We'll see. But so it actually was always kind of directed towards more general audiences, but of course, coming out of my research. And that changes not simply the scope and that you can be broader. Like if this were an academic book covering these topics, it would be like 5 books. Like to really do it the right way, to really survey the full state of scholarship and show exactly the contribution, all of that, it really would take that much work. And so the advantage and really what we need right now is something that is a bit more digestible, something that can really introduce people to Christian social thought from an Orthodox point of view, to modern economics and modern economies from an Orthodox point of view, and can get the conversation started. So then hopefully we'll start to see those more academic works on all sorts of specific questions. But in the meantime, that was kind of my idea, is I wanted this book to be a one-stop shop for anybody who cares deeply about their Orthodox faith, or even, frankly, even just their Christian faith. I think ecumenical readers will get a lot out of this book. But people who care a lot about that, care a lot about Christ's command to care for the least of these among us, but are somewhat perplexed by our modern world and especially our modern economies, because it's a very different world than first century Judea. We still need to be faithful to Christ's teachings and teachings of the church fathers and all of that, but it takes a little bit of translation to get there.
So that translation starts in a bunch of different places, and it starts the way you've divided up the book and how you talk about Orthodox social thought goes through, as you've already talked about, other Christian traditions of Christian social thought. The Bible itself, there is some talk about first century Judea in this book.
Yeah, there is.
And in fact, even earlier times.
Yep.
There's a discussion of church history, of the Orthodox Church's own history and the history of those nations in which the Orthodox Church predominates. There's a discussion of modern economics, and then there's a discussion of sort of those contemporary developments in Orthodox theology where it has some applicability to these sort of social questions. How did you decide on this structure? Because I think this structure is one of the actually big selling points of the book and what makes it very distinctive and comprehensive.
Yeah, so part of it to me is a way of I guess popularizing the neo-patristic method of Father George Florovsky and some others, maybe Vladimir Lossky from the 20th century, who really emphasized that orthodoxy has to be rooted in tradition and the church fathers, and that in doing so, we're actually going to find a lot more ecumenical common ground. These people, Father Florovsky, was very strong in his convictions about the Orthodox Church, but also very involved in the ecumenical movement. And so that's kind of my model, is that you have to know what the other Christians are saying, and then you have to start with the biggest territory of common ground we have, which is the Bible, even though we don't all agree about exactly which books go in it. For the most part, we agree. And there's quite a lot of common ground that comes out of that. And then we got to know our own story, right? And even in reading the scriptures from an Orthodox point of view, we always read the scriptures with the church and with the fathers. And so that goes into it. And then I guess my own addition to that is that when you're dealing with a question like, how do we help the poor? Well, you can't ignore the one social science that has been around for like 250 years that's entirely focused on how do we help the poor, right? Economics. We have to do some careful interdisciplinary work to really do this well today. Otherwise, we just end up being kind of moralists. Pope Benedict XVI actually criticized those on the one hand, economists who don't think they need a moral grounding, but on the other hand, moralists who are just pontificating. Sorry, maybe wrong. Shouldn't use that pejorative. Not an ecumenically sensitive pejorative, but who are just kind of, railing against things they see as evil, but they haven't taken the time to really understand what they're talking about. And so I really wanted to avoid both those pitfalls and be really, really true to our tradition and to Orthodox moral teaching, while at the same time really giving modern economics its due.
So you begin the discussion by framing it in terms of the idea of Christian social teaching, and particularly drilling down into what we in the Christian social thought business refer to as the social question, which is how this gets framed in different traditions. What is the social question?
Yeah.
Where does that come out of? And how have different churches sought to answer this question?
Yeah. So the social question was a term used to describe the plight of the working poor during the Industrial Revolutions. So you first see Christian engagement with this in Britain. And actually, I kind of save that for later on in the book when I get to Christian socialism and evangelicalism and the history of economics, because it's actually intertwined with the history of modern economics. But other traditions, you see suddenly it gets to Catholic lands, and what do you know? You have a papal encyclical, Rerum Novarum, that addresses the new revolutionary change in the relationship between capital and labor. Or it gets to the Netherlands, and you have Abraham Kuyper with his lecture, The Social Question and Christian Religion, and the first Christian Social Congress in the Netherlands, which was co-sponsored by Kuyper's political party and the labor organization Patrimonium. And you can see it maybe a little bit earlier in Lutheran lands, in German and Danish lands, with people like Ada von Harless and Hans Lasse Martensen. And so there's this encounter as the world begins to radically change, that really even through the early modern era, you still have a lot of more traditional societal structures intact. I talk later in the book about how there was an old Christian map that basically everybody shared across traditions, and that was that society had three estates or realms or whatever you want to call them of church, state, and family. And that was pretty accurate for a long time. And you can see this across catechetical literature. So if you look at the Tridentine Catechism, or if you look at the Westminster Catechism, or Luther's catechisms, or even Orthodox catechisms, when they get to the commandment of love or honor your father and mother, they say, well, this also extends to other legitimate authorities. And so they list church authorities and state authorities. So you have family, church, state. Again and again, that's kind of the way in which Christians were approaching social life. And it's not that they didn't have businesses, but most businesses were either family businesses or state businesses, or in some cases, church businesses. There wasn't kind of a separate sphere, to use Kuyper's term, of business and of commerce. You see a little bit of fraying of this in the late Middle Ages with the rise of guilds, that kind of starts to get incorporated and people are trying to theologize around it. But even, again, like I said, even into the early modern era, this is still kind of the normal framework, and it just becomes an outdated blueprint by the mid-19th century. And so different traditions are grappling with this because they want to be true to the timeless teachings of Christ and of the scriptures and of church history, but they have a very, very new reality. Again, to use Pope Leo XIII's phrase, it's new things, right? Revolutionary change. There has to be some commentary on that, or else the church is just going to be, kind of a crying out in the wilderness, but nobody really listening.
So when we talk about new things, let's say like semiconductors or suspension bridges or climatology, we don't usually look to the Bible for answers to those new things. Yet, right after you turn to hey, there's these new things, these other Christian traditions are grappling with these new things, then immediately you turn to the oldest thing that the churches have. Why?
Literally,
why should you do that?
Literally, I turn to in the beginning.
Yes.
Well, because every church needs to be faithful to the Bible. I mean, we all, whatever our differing opinions, we all agree that it's God's word. We all want to be faithful to it, and it needs to, continue to live on in us today. And so, we do need to understand things like modern economics, or if you're doing climate science, or you're doing, engineering and all that sort of stuff, you need to have some competence there. But I think when you're writing a theological work and you're trying to understand a theological approach, you have to start with the proper foundations of that theology, and that's got to start with the Bible. So that's the understanding. I do get to economics, as I said, the kind of the technical science that we have today. But we got to know, okay, what is it that we're trying to bring into dialogue with the modern world, with these new things? And if we don't have what is it figured out, if we just kind of assume we know it and we haven't really dug into it, we're bound to make some errors. And I think I and quite a few points I point out where sometimes that has happened in Christian tradition, at least within my own tradition. Yeah,
when let's drill down a little bit into the Bible, because it's one thing, you get this with a lot, and it happens across religious traditions. It is most noticeable in Protestant traditions because they're very proudly Bible-forward traditions. Mm-hmm. And then everything just gets labeled biblical. It's the biblical way, it's biblical marriage. It's biblical child-rearing. Right. It's biblical, etc. And sometimes that's really robustly informed. Mm-hmm. sometimes it's just sort of a veneer and smattering on some Bible phrases,
Yes.
Bible words, but isn't really rooted in sort of the internal logic of the scriptures. Give me a for instance of your grappling with the scriptures in this book where you're trying to think through these questions, or you're trying to bring these questions to bear on the scriptural tradition, and you're really unpacking that in a scriptural way.
Yeah. So, really drawing from my own theological education, which was largely at Protestant schools. I went to Kuiper College and Calvin Seminary before finishing my PhD at St. Mary's in Twickenham, which that's Catholic, but the first two are Protestant and Calvinist. And one of the things I learned about was biblical theology. And the idea of this is very much to guard against the sort of shallow, we're going to call everything we do biblical sort of thing, to make sure that when we use the Bible, we're respecting it and using it well, and it's not just a matter of proof texting. And in combination with that, what makes this a more orthodox approach is that I make sure that I'm always doing so in dialogue with the church fathers. They, unsurprisingly, read the Bible and commented quite a lot on it and referenced it in their own teaching and preaching. And so it's really great to have their guidance right alongside, the tools I learned in my biblical interpretation courses and things like that. So one thing that I think is really interesting insight that came about through the course of this reading was to really get that there is an orthodox understanding of the relationship between the law and the gospel. And this is, I think, pretty different from, say, a Lutheran understanding. They're probably the most well-known for emphasizing the distinction between the law and the gospel. But from a Lutheran point of view, to speak in general terms, I'm sure there's nuances. But the law is to show you God's impossible standard and to prick your conscience and awaken you to your need for grace. And then grace is, God coming in and making up what's lacking. There's some truth to that. We all, as St. Paul says, we all fall short of the glory of God. We all have sinned. But what I found again and again among the church fathers was something I'd only encountered elsewhere, actually in the work of Wolfgang Musculus, the Bern reformer, and through our mutual former colleague, Jordan Baller. And that is that the gospel is actually a higher standard than the law. And I thought that was really turned things on its head. So this idea that the law, to the extent that it's good and still even legitimate today, is grounded in the natural law. And that's pretty common across Christian traditions, that kind of basic Ten Commandments morality that people tend to know pretty intuitively, whether or not they've fully worked it out, that you can trust that if you go to that appeal to conscience, you're kind of assuming that there's this basic moral framework that everybody at some level is tapped into. That's where the law comes from, but Christ asks us to go beyond that. And actually we see that in his language, right? You have heard it was said, but I tell you. He says this again and again and again. And the but I tell you is not, but don't worry, it's easier. It's always but it's harder. Now, the good news is, it's only harder in one sense. We do have grace, right? The law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. St. John says that. So the gospel is at once a higher standard, but we are also empowered to live up to that standard. And one of the many differences that I think is very notable is that the law is fundamentally impersonal. Right? It has to be impartial to be justice. And that's what laws aim at, including the law of Moses, although I do think it goes beyond that in certain points. And certainly the prophets, urge for mercy. You see even David in Psalm 50 or 51 in some Bibles, his psalm of repentance when he says, have mercy on me, O God. He's come to the limits of the law. He's committed murder. There was no sacrifice that could get you forgiven for murder. So he says, sacrifices and offerings you did not desire, right? Sorry, that's quoting a different prophet, but he says, well, I don't want to recite the whole psalm, but I could, but it would take too long. But anyway, he says a contrite heart, right?
Yeah.
This is the acceptable sacrifice. This is how, he realizes he needs something more than the law, that it's not just a matter of justice. He needs God's mercy. And then again, you look at Christ and he says, be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. And what's interesting is the application, whereas the law needs to be impersonal. And in that sense, it even commands, don't be partial to the rich or the poor, right? Treat everyone equally, have that rule of law. The gospel is always particular. It's always personal. Clement of Alexandria points out that while there's the rich young ruler, Christ tells them, well, sell all you have and come follow me. Nevertheless, he tells Zacchaeus, today salvation has come to your house. When Zacchaeus had only given away half, right? And Matthew the tax collector, he just says, come follow me. He doesn't even tell him to sell anything. And that's good enough, right? In fact, he goes to a party at his house, right? And the point isn't that none of us should have to sell everything. In fact, we have this wonderful tradition of monasticism in the Orthodox Church. Some of us, that is our calling, but it really is a calling. And, this might be where we kind of come full circle and would agree with the Lutherans that there is a reality of vocation that goes beyond a clerical calling. It's every single individual person God really does have a plan for, and he really does meet us where we're at. And I think that framework is really, really helpful. It really spans through the whole book. And I'm so glad that I took the time to go slowly through the Bible and treat, some basic component parts. I don't go through every book or anything like that, but I try to give it this careful treatment. And in so doing, I'm able to kind of call back to it throughout the book and make sure that we're remaining faithful to that really fundamental distinction.
So this is one of the patterns of the book, and this is one of the patterns of Scripture itself, which is it's highlight the continuity and then extend the logic and grow it out from there.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about, how the law and gospel sort of function in this way. And then you make the transition from that, from the experience of the Hebrew prophets of old through the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, then into the life of the early church. But that doesn't stop there. The church doesn't go away as the Scriptures end. It continues, and in very concrete historical forms. And you go through that.
Mm-hmm.
What was that experience like going through that? What were you looking for on the one hand?
Yeah.
But then what were you surprised by? And what did you discover as you were digging deeper into this history? Because you focus mostly on the Orthodox world, but that's a very large world.
It is, yes.
And there's a lot of facets to it.
Yeah, and I really don't even cover it all. I have to begin by apologizing in that section, that part of the book, by saying, I really wish I could have written about the Orthodox Church in the Balkans and, Romania, Syria, Bulgaria, or even over, in Georgia. But to my knowledge, it just isn't enough translated into English, and I just don't know those languages. So I'm sure there's amazing resources in their history and tradition as well, but I couldn't really incorporate that just due to my own limitations. So as far as what I was looking for, the one thing I knew I would find, just because I had kind of already found it in my research, is the role of asceticism in Orthodox spirituality and in Orthodox social thought. So I think often if people think of asceticism, if they don't have a negative understanding of it, they think of it in pretty personal terms, right? So I fast and maybe I give to a charity, or, maybe I go on a retreat where we practice silence and that kind of thing. And that's all good stuff. But what my research has pointed to, and I do see this confirmed again and again throughout Christian history, is that's actually not at all the limit of it. I can't have a relationship with another person unless I stop and I listen and I give you my time and attention. I have to deny myself to have a relationship with you. There's something fundamentally ascetic at the root of all society. And the early church, and Orthodoxy in particular, has always had an ascetic ethos. And that really brings that social core to fulfillment. So that's something that I expected, and I did find, and I point to it over and over again, from the early church through monasticism, but also through all sorts of other examples. Even, the Emperor Theodosius doing penance, public penance, right? This is as far as you can get from monasticism in the ancient world, and yet you still have asceticism very publicly displayed. But as far as surprising things, there were quite a few. So I added a whole chapter from the outline that I'd proposed when the book was accepted to include the experience of Middle Eastern Orthodox Christians, or Melkites, from the fall of Jerusalem to about the Ottoman Empire, or at least the early modern era. And there was just so much there. I knew vaguely that the scholastic method had its origins with Middle Eastern Christians, but you really can see that again and again. They talk about the importance of reason. They use reasoned arguments to have ecumenical discussions and debates. They don't agree on everything, but they're civil about it. They even develop a kind of natural theology. And in all these cases, it does always come around to how are they caring for the least of these among them? How are they caring for each other? I mean, Christians had to look out for each other when suddenly they were second-class citizens. Another big surprise was when I started studying the medieval Rus. I certainly knew about the Russian Empire. We love to remind people of Dostoevsky and all these great traditions from Russian literature. Right, a lot of these authors were, or at least were, influenced by the Orthodoxy. But I didn't quite know what I was going to find when it came to looking at the Kievan Rus and the Mongol period and early, Muscovite times. And one of the most exciting things to discover was that there's actually a tradition of democracy in the Orthodox Church. This isn't like a new idea that, came from like the Western Enlightenment. Frankly, it's not, in the West, it doesn't come from the Western Enlightenment either. There's all sorts of medieval republics throughout Germany and Italy. And, the Magna Carta is, from the Middle Ages as well in Britain. But the exact same thing happens in the Christian East. So a lot of these towns, Vladimir, Kiev, and others, they have what's called a vechi, a citizen's body. So whether you're an aristocrat or just a normal citizen, people were able to vote on their laws, on their rulers. They could depose their rulers in some cases. And when the Mongols came through, a lot of that was lost. But in the case of Novgorod and Pskov, it remained because they very wisely just preemptively surrendered, and they'd agreed to pay a tax, and then they were left alone. And because of that, Novgorod was a republic for 350 years. And we have copies of one of their legal charters. Article 1 is rule of law, which should be unsurprising. It's same thing when you get to Byzantine law. Whatever people may think of it, whatever faults it may have, it has this concept of rule of law again and again. And that's something that really revitalized Western law when it was finally, reintroduced in the Middle Ages over there. And you see it in the Christian East as well. So I think that's a really great resource. They were also dependent upon trade because they're so far north. They had, a kind of fur trade-based economy, but just to get grain, they had to trade with, people down south. And so there's that experience of commerce. They had a great relationship with the German Hanseatic League. There's just this well of resources that, like, I knew something of what was there. I've been studying church history for, nearly 2 decades now, right? But there were still things that I discovered in the process of writing this book that really got me excited.
So one of the things that's very unique about the Orthodox tradition, which I've learned from you, is how closely related, in many cases, the building up of a commercial society was with monastic institutions in the East.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the things that I think is a very distinctive. There are Western parallels, but the extent of it in the Christian East is remarkable. Could you share a little bit with the listeners about that?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, scholars for a long time have acknowledged the importance of Western monasticism as like a civilizational force. And I think that includes economic force as well. But at the same time, some of those same scholars, especially in the 19th century, were very dismissive of the Christian East. And as far as I can tell, they did like no research. Like they didn't open a book. They don't cite anything. And it turns out we have the same history. So going all the way back to the Desert Fathers in ancient Egypt, they owned boats and shipped goods up and down the Nile. We often see monasteries connected with small villages and rural areas. And at the monastery, you also see evidence of a market. So it was like people would come to the monastery to then trade their goods or to trade with the monks. And there's a certain inner logic to it that, yes, monks were trying to flee the world, but they were not Gnostic, at least in most cases. They didn't think the material world was evil. What they were trying to do is just be true to the gospel, to really... I put it this way, that monks are like professional ascetics. They're trying to be like the Kobe Bryant of asceticism, like I might be able to shoot hoops or what, I wish I can barely do, but I can shoot a basket or whatever, but I'm not going to compete with like an NBA star. But that's kind of like the same sort of thing. Like we all got to have some athleticism. We got to be healthy and all of that. But they're like, this is going to be my job. This is all I'm going to do. But it turns out, so they go out to the desert and they realize that, well, if we don't actually work and produce some good to sell, then we have to be dependent upon donations. And in fact, they're very uncomfortable with this in the Christian East. There's not much of a mendicant sort of tradition. There are one or two, monks that's how they subsist, but a lot of them are producing goods and trading. And again, this goes all the way through the centuries, and it also corresponds to an appreciation for private property. So even if within monastic communities, the individuals might not technically have private property, although in some cases, even then they did. But monasteries themselves, at least through the Middle Ages and the Byzantine era, were technically neither church nor state owned. They were usually founded on an aristocratic estate, and they remained basically the property of that estate, or they'd be kind of their own entity. And we have these great founding documents. There's one where he calls upon this imprecatory invocation of all the punishments against Judas for anyone who would allow this monastery to fall in the hands of emperor or patriarch or archbishop or bishop or, just any authority he can think of. He wants it to be independent and free. And so we have this civic tradition that grows out of our monasteries. We have this economic tradition of commerce, not only producing in order to provide for their needs, but of course, so they have extra, so that they can give to the poor, so they can be giving alms. They want to have that as well. And it really, spreads a certain ethos that if you are producing a lot and consuming very little, because they are ascetics and they're not, eating big feasts every night or whatever, it's pretty easy to get wealthy. Right? If you're able to find a trade that is in demand and you work it and you spend very little on yourself and you own all your property, whatever, so you're taking care of all that. You're sharing the risk. You're sharing the benefit. Just like you find in the West, for example, with the Franciscans, that within 100 years suddenly went from not owning shoes to owning massive estates. Right? Same thing happens in the East, for better and worse. There are times where the enmeshment with commerce really brought the world back into the monastery. But there are other times where I think they really stand as an example of good Christian commerce, so really through centuries and through different ages and different regimes. So I point to that often as an example of why asceticism is so important from an Orthodox point of view and just for Christian social thought in general. I mean, really every Christian tradition has an ascetic tradition, even the ones who don't like the word asceticism. They just call it spiritual disciplines instead. But they're talking about the same thing. But it's not often, it doesn't often come up when they start talking about the social question and Christian social thought. And that's something that I do think is a unique contribution of our Orthodox Church. And it's something we can see all throughout our history. So it's not just in theory, it's something that we've actually put into practice.
So if there's this rich tradition of practice, going back from the scriptures through the life of the church, you even have things like limited government, rule of law, commercial society. Why bring economics into it? What does sort of social science have to contribute to this rich tradition? And how and what is the relationship between the two? Like why bring them into dialogue? If all of this is here before Adam Smith is a gleam in his daddy's eye, why turn to a tradition of economics.
Right. I mean, I think any economic historian will tell you that, of course, there was commerce before Adam Smith. There was profit. There was, functioning societies. At the same time, however, they would tell you that not necessarily as cause, but at least coincidentally with Adam Smith, around the time he wrote and certainly afterwards, there's just a massive upturn in global wealth. So for most of human history, global wealth is pretty much flat. And there's some small ups and downs, and really, if you lived at those times, those ups and downs were not small at all. The ups were really important, and the downs were really hard, right? But comparatively, throughout history, there's just nothing like the modern world, really, since, we'll say, 1800, or maybe in the last 250 years. So that'd be 1775, and 1776 is when The Wealth of the Nations was published. And that's through the Industrial Revolution, and it's through the work throughout the 19th century of the early political economists to change the world based on their new science. So why we need them is to understand this new world. So to give a sense of the importance of this and the really dramatic difference, in about 1800, there was maybe 1 billion people in the world instead of 8. And about 80% of them lived in extreme poverty. Today, there are 8 billion people and only 8% of them live in that extreme poverty. That's a wonderful thing. That's something we should be grateful for. That means more people, more hungry are fed, more naked are clothed, all those things that Jesus said that we need to do. We better know how that happened. And studying and learning about how that happened really helps us understand how the modern world works, what's good about it, also what's dangerous about it, what we need to be cautious about. And you just can't do that without some basic understanding of economics. And studying the history of economics is really a good way of seeing the more human struggle involved in the development of that discipline. So I think that needs to be brought in to play because, yeah, we do have this rich history, but the face of the world really has changed in a way that is unprecedented in human history before it. And so if we don't have those tools, you could just, you could pull things out of various texts. You might even get some good advice, but it's going to be outdated, like genuinely outdated, if that's all that you have.
So I want to have you back in a month or two to talk more about sort of the history of economic analysis that you give, because I think that's really important, and it's important to folks in all sorts of religious traditions, and it's important to folks with no religious tradition. It's really, again, I think there's a lot that I learned as a non-Orthodox Christian about the scriptures, about history, about economics, about all of these things. But I think like the widest audience, possible for every section is actually that last section. Because I think it's really valuable as just a concise history of the discipline and why it's important. And I want to dig into that deeper.
Sure.
But I want to focus primarily, because the audience for this book is primarily religious, and it's primarily not only just religious, but Eastern Orthodox in particular. And I wanted to make sure we had time to get into these particularly Orthodox questions and approaches that make up the last part of your book.
Yeah.
This is where folks who aren't Orthodox might be the most lost.
Yeah.
But it also might be where the folks that, let's say they are Orthodox, and let's say they're watching YouTube or they're reading sort of pop Orthodox apologetics, they might have heard of some of these terms before and some of these controversies and some of these issues you deal with. They might not necessarily have the historical background, the Bible background, everything else, but I think the way that you treat these issues and bring them back into dialogue with the church's earlier history, with the scriptures themselves, and talk about them in the context of these various ways to address the social question is really, really helpful, both for folks who are really in to the inside baseball, and
Sure.
for folks who are totally out of it and these terms might be new.
Yeah. So the last part of the book deals with contemporary Orthodox contributions and contemporary challenges. And really, there's three that I focus on. The first is Sophia, the second is Sobornos, and then the third is liturgical theology. So Sophia is just Greek for wisdom, but among especially Russian Orthodox writers in the early 20th century, they developed a study of wisdom in the Orthodox tradition, which they called sophiology. And this is somewhat controversial for reasons I don't really get into in my book. I don't really get into it not because those aren't important, why it's controversial, but because I really do think the benefits, the insights transcend that controversy. So I just kind of focus on, well, what can we get out of this? And so there's two key figures I focus on, although there's certainly more in the history of the church that talked about this. But I talk about Father Sergei Bulgakov, who actually was originally a Marxist economist before returning to faith and eventually being ordained a priest. And then the other is Father Pavel Florensky, who was a philosopher and who, unlike a lot of intellectuals, stayed behind after the revolution and eventually was martyred. Bulgakov talks about Sophia. In terms of it's kind of this big, shaggy, baggy concept and this is part of the reason it gets becomes controversial is sometimes the terminology is a little blurry. But he really is focusing on this idea of the creative action of God, right? That in the Proverbs we hear about God creating the world through his wisdom, and also other wisdom literature in our Bibles like Ecclesiasticus and the Wisdom of Solomon. There's a sense in which you could think of the Psalms also that God's word has gone out to all the earth through creation, right? That all of creation is the spoken word of God, as we learn in Genesis. And so there's this imprint of God's wisdom on creation. And in humanity, and especially through the incarnation, we see the uniting of this, uncreated Sophia, right? The wisdom of God with this kind of created fruit of that creativeness, that production of God, coming together and being brought once again to be what is created for and meant to be. And so for Bulgakov, he sees our economic production, our human creativity, as a participation in the wisdom through which the world was created, that it's almost like a little window back into paradise. And yes, we do it this side of Eden in thorns and thistles, right? We have our sin and hardship. But at the same time, when we really produce something good, there's something just beautiful and dare I say, magical about that. And I think any artist has had this experience. That's maybe a more relatable way because, if you go to just your job, you might not feel that way about whatever it is. I've worked at factories. I've been a janitor. I've worked at fast food. It doesn't feel as noble, although I'll get into that in a minute. But if you really work hard on a creative project, and then, I just finished a book. That's why we're talking and reading through the proofs. You do a lot of editing. It can be a painful process, but reading through the final proofs, I was very happy to have that feeling of, oh, good, I do like this book. I do. It is a good book, right? And that's something that is really irreplaceable. So it's something that, in order to provide for our needs, we have to use our creativity. That's what economic production is all about. And so for Bulgakov, that is a participation in this divine wisdom, and it's a picture into how the world was created to be in paradise. Florensky, interestingly, uses the same concept to talk about friendship. He talks about how when two people get together and they have this, intangible connection, right? The two people that just seem in step. That C.S. Lewis talks about friendship starting with two people saying, "What, you too? I thought I was the only one." You find that connection that you just click with someone. Well, out of that, something new is produced, right? You have the relationship, right? The friendship that comes from it. And as friends, you produce things. And in fact, we can even combine these two if we think of the fact that a lot of people today, at least statistically, form friendships on the workplace, like you and I, right? At the water cooler.
Podcasts come out of
That's right. That's right. Maybe too many, but yeah. But there's that creativity. Friends don't just get together; they want to make stuff together, right? And again, like there's this idea of God creating through wisdom, it being this kind of handmaiden of creation, but also creating us to be in friendship with him, to walk together with him in the garden, and to walk with one another in that same way. And so then I relate this to the rest of the book, in part through those biblical writings, wisdom literature, which I've already talked about, but also in the history of economics. Early political economists, a lot of them were Christian ministers. And again, even Adam Smith actually talks this way, and people debate how religious he was, but he does talk this way about the division of labor and international trade, how it is something that you look on the outside and you say, wow, how ingenious. But the reality is you're mistaking something as being the product of human wisdom, which is actually a matter of divine wisdom. That when we go to work, well, we're trying to provide for ourselves and for our family. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a very good thing. But we end up doing so much more. And so an example I give in my book is I used to work at a medical parts factory here in town, actually 2 different ones. And I remember thinking, working on those parts, because it could be really, repetitive and could be monotonous, that sort of thing. But I remember taking a step back and realizing one day, what I'm making, these are all life-saving devices. Yeah, sure, they're little tubes or doodads, although some were like rib separators for heart surgery and that sort of thing. But this is life-saving stuff, and it's actually, I'm part of something much bigger, and you can extend it actually beyond that. So, I mentioned the janitor and the fast food worker and all of that. Well, like you need truckers, and you need trucks, and you need auto mechanics to make the trucks, and then you need the guys in the auto factories. We got a lot of those here in Michigan as well. They had to make the trucks to ship the parts to the hospital so that somebody could have a life-saving operation. And pretty soon you realize that these everyday miracles. People right now praying for a loved one who has an upcoming operation. Sometimes God supernaturally answers that prayer, right? And it's a miracle in that sense. But more often, it's an everyday miracle that we say, oh, it's a miracle. The operation was a success. We're not wrong to say that's a miracle. It's just a different kind of miracle. It's a miracle of the entire economy. And that's what Sophia gives us a lens for seeing, that all those everyday miracles that people are hoping for and need come about through our work. And however insignificant we might think our work is, it at least can, and hopefully does, contribute to these broader, greater goods. So that's Sophia. Sobornost is actually a Russian word that comes from the Old Slavonic version of the Nicene Creed, when it says one holy Catholic and apostolic church. It's the word for Catholic. And one thing I trace all throughout church history is this idea of Catholicity. And this is a very, very central concept to the book. The idea that, going all the way back to St. Ignatius of Antioch, that in Christ, all the different poles of existence are united. So we have, of course, creator and creation. He's both God and man. We have heaven and earth coming together. We also have, Ignatius connects us to the relationship between bishops and the clergy. That's, in fact, the first known use of the phrase the Catholic Church. Catholic in Greek meaning through the whole or holistic, right? So he's not just talking about universal. He's talking about through the whole of creation. And then at the same time, he criticizes the Gnostics, people outside of the church. He says, they care nothing for love. They neglect the poor and the fatherless and the widow among them. Well, this extends to everyone's material circumstances. It extends to the division between rich and poor. The Catholicity in Christ through the incarnation, through his death and resurrection, and through the sacraments as well, taking material things and offering them up to God and receiving his grace through them. We are able to transcend these divides. And it's sort of a Christologically grounded solidarity. And that's what you see in Sobornost. And so I look at The contributions of S.L. Frank and St. Maria Skobtsova, talking about that. Frank talks about it in terms of personal versus impersonal. Once again, it comes back to kind of the law and the gospel, that, we need those kind of external, impersonal structures of society. If we think of law or the state, or even, maybe the cold contracts or transactions of a more impersonal market, well, all of that needs this more personal, internal, spiritual life. So, a business wouldn't let customers come into their store without some basic level of trust, right? And he says that's subornos. That's what we're talking about. And of course, from an Orthodox point of view, we think it's most perfectly fulfilled in the church. And so this is also his way of relating the church and the world, or as, the title of my book hints at, the kingdom of God and the common good. Not to say the church is the kingdom, but the church is kind of the world becoming the kingdom of God. And then lastly, and then St. Maria Skobtsova, she talks about kind of that more ascetic dimension again. She says we shouldn't just follow the imitation of Christ, which is often this individualistic sort of pursuit. It's a good thing, right, to die and rise with Christ, but we need to also imitate the Mother of God, Mary, who, it was said, a sword will pierce your own soul as well. And that was her looking on at the crucifixion. And it wasn't her dying, but she was, in a sense, co-crucified with Christ, that she suffered with her son. And through that, she's able to, really embody our need to suffer with others, to come alongside them in whatever they're going through. And St. Mary really lived this. She was in exile like many from Russia. She ended up in Paris, and she served the poor very actively. And then when the Nazis came in 1940, she hid Jewish families until she too was sent to a concentration camp and eventually executed. But she was an amazing theologian, and she left us with this really wonderful example and concept. And she, once again, did relate it to subornos, to that Catholicity, that, again, it's not just this individual pursuit, but it's something that connects us to every other human being. So lastly, it's a long answer to your question, but it's a very good question, is liturgical theology. And this is the one that maybe people might have heard of before, whether Orthodox or others, usually largely through the work of Father Alexander Schmemann in his little book For the Life of the World, which I highly recommend. But he wrote more than that, and I recommend his other books too. In fact, I draw quite a bit from his church history in part 3 of my book. And he also wrote a book on Great Lent. And I think bringing together that alongside For the Life of the World gives us a fuller picture of liturgical theology, that is not only a focus on how does our liturgical life and our sacramental life teach us how to live in the world, which it does, and how does, the fact that we take the material things of the world, we offer them to God, and God offers himself to us through them, that through the bread and the wine, we receive the body and blood of Christ. We become Christ's body in the church. But also there's this ascetic dynamic that I think deserves more commentary. So we don't receive the sacraments in the Orthodox Church without fasting beforehand, unless you have like health concerns or something like that. It's usually a total fast Sunday mornings until we receive the Eucharist. And then all throughout Lent, we fast for 40 days. It's more of an ascetic fast, or I guess a lighter fast would be a way of putting it, where we fast from meat and dairy, or as good as we can do it. We don't all succeed. But that's for the whole 40 days of Lent. Same thing for Advent, and there's a few other periods throughout the year, as well as every Wednesday and Friday. And it comes out to about half the year we're fasting, but it's always connected with the liturgy. It's connected with this church year rhythm. So we're doing it in anticipation of the resurrection, or anticipation of the birth of Christ. And then the result is traditionally supposed to be that, just like the monks in the ancient world and today, if you consume less for yourself, you should have more to give. Just like Isaiah said in Isaiah 58, the kind of fast that God has chosen for his people is not to just go around looking sad and not eating, but to free the captives and to feed the hungry and to help the afflicted. That's what it's supposed to be all about. And so we have this really at the core of the Orthodox life today. It's something that has gotten some good reflection, but sometimes that social aspect is neglected because I think the ascetic aspect gets neglected. So I try to bring that out as well.
So I want to conclude by opening up an even bigger can of worms.
Okay.
I think the book is excellent. I highly recommend you get it. We will have a link to the show notes where you can get it. But it's so multifaceted. You mentioned at the beginning that, this is really something that could be 5 books. And what I want is 5 more books by Dylan Pahman, exploring each of these things in even more depth.
Yeah.
Is that a future dream? What are the projects?
Yeah.
Now that you've started this excellent conversation starter,
right?
What in it, and you've been working on this for some time. In a lot of ways, your entire academic career has been building to this in a lot of senses.
Yeah.
Now that it's out the door, now that it's in people's hands, hopefully priests, lay people, everybody will get interested in this. What's next in terms of your scholarship?
Yeah. So, in terms academically, it would be good to have a more academic take on this. And like I said, that kind of writing, that kind of research and publication, that would take probably multiple volumes. But I do think I'm actually much more excited about more accessibly written stuff. I like to popularize the research. I like to reach a bit broader audiences. So you mentioned at the beginning, I'm president and founder of a new institute, the St. Cabasilas Institute. That is a work in progress. It's kind of a side project. I'm still very happily here at Acton, at least for the time being. And but what I want to do is have an institutional home for scholars. It's something that I don't want to be the only one doing this, and I'm really not anymore. But I really want to mobilize Orthodox scholars to come around different projects and to support them, to network them with one another, to connect them with the resources they need to start producing that scholarship in a more active way. So as far as my own book projects and other writing, there's quite a bit I'd like to do. I'd love to do a profile, an ecumenical profile of some of these early figures dealing with the social question. I'd love to do maybe even just a paper comparing Kuyper and the Orthodox tradition. Abraham Kuyper is so fascinating, and I do write about him in the book when I talk about Neo-Calvinism, but he's a minor area of my own research. I've published 6 papers on Kuyper, and I think he's really fascinating. There's really unexpected common ground, ways in which his social thought dovetails from an Orthodox perspective. There are also plenty of contrasts as well, but I really think it's a fruitful dialogue that's just waiting to happen. But we need a resource like this book that I've written for that conversation to get started. And so I'm hoping this book will be, the first of many to come along those lines, whether it's academic or more popularly oriented. I'd love to write a book that's just kind of, okay, here's the Cliff's Notes, right? Here's like the 150-page version of, instead of going through all this history, kind of getting to the brass tacks of, here's some basic principles and here's an example of how to use them. But I really didn't feel I could write that book without having written this book first, because no one would be able to evaluate whether I actually knew what I was talking about unless I wrote this book. It would just kind of feel like I was asserting stuff, or I would feel too tempted because I am a scholar that I'd have to heavily footnote everything I said, and then nobody would want to read it because that's not the sort of book that normal people read. You have to be, a nerd like me to be like, oh, this is cool. Look at all the footnotes, So I didn't want to have to do that either, right? This is a book that had to be written, that really needs to be written. And I did my best to try to write it in a way that's as inviting as possible, but hopefully it'll be the first of many more to come.
Dylan, thank you for starting this conversation. This is a great book. Highly recommend you out there get it. Highly recommend for priests and lay people. This is a big book in the sense of, yes, it's over 300 pages, but it is a very accessibly written book and it covers a lot of ground. So it's really, you could think about it as 5 little books.
Yeah, right. You can read a little book.
And you can read a little bok. You can read, you can get your orientation and where is the state of Christian social thought today across traditions? How do we think about the Bible through this lens? How do we think about church history through this lens? Let's get an introduction to economics as a social science and then the history of the discipline. And then let's look at some contemporary problems. It's a very accessible book. Highly recommend it. Dylan, thank you so much
for
being on the program.
Great to be here.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.